Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the massive battleship Yamato, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed across the vast Pacific expanse. The date was June 2nd, 1942, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing for what would become the most decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War. 6 months had passed since the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had catapulted America into World War II, and Japan's military machine had rolled across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as Yamamoto contemplated his audacious plan. Operation Me, as it was designated, would lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a trap near Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand that had become strategically vital. The plan was elegant in its complexity, a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American forces north, while the main Japanese fleet would strike Midway and destroy any American ships that dared to respond. Vice Admiral Kichi Nagumo commanded the striking force aboard the aircraft. Carrier Akagi, the same ship that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack. His fleet included 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers, Akagi, Tsuyu, and Hiryu, along with their escorts of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. These vessels carried over 250 aircraft and represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation. Their pilots were veterans hardened by months of combat across the Pacific, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles to the northeast, Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over intercepts in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor. His Kryptonos had been working around the clock, breaking Japanese naval codes with methodical precision. The intelligence they had gathered painted a clear picture. The Japanese were planning something massive, and Midway was the target. According to declassified documents from the National Security Agency archives, Rochefort's team had achieved what many thought impossible. Penetrating the Japanese J-125 naval code, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received Rochefort's intelligence with characteristic calm. The soft-spoken Texan understood the implications immediately. This was America's chance to turn the tide of a war that had brought nothing but defeats and retreats. The Japanese had enjoyed 6 months of uninterrupted victory, conquering territory from Wake Island to the Solomon Islands, but their success had also stretched their lines dangerously thin. The American response would be swift and decisive. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, centered around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, was built around the recently damaged carrier Yorktown, which had been rushed through repairs at Pearl Harbor in an incredible 72 hours. The combined American force consisted of 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and approximately 233 aircraft. As dawn broke on June 3rd, 1942, both fleets were converging on Midway Atoll, a cluster of tiny islands that would soon witness one of history's most pivotal naval battles. The Japanese came with overwhelming confidence, having never lost a major naval engagement. The Americans approached with grim determination, knowing they were outnumbered but possessing something the Japanese lacked: advance. Knowledge of their enemy's plans. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War and reshape the balance of global power for generations to come. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942, hung heavy over the Pacific as Admiral Nagumo's carrier force approached Midway from the northwest. At 4:30 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft began launching from the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. 108 planes, 36 Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers armed with bombs, 36 Aichi Val dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters roared into the sky toward Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the strike force through the tropical morning air, his aircraft laden with high-explosive bombs intended to neutralize Midway's airfields and defensive positions. The Japanese plan called for this initial assault to suppress American air power based on the atoll, clearing the way for an amphibious invasion scheduled for the following day. What Tominaga and his pilots didn't know was that American radar operators on Midway had detected their approach at 5:20 in the morning. When the strike force was still 93 miles away, the alarm bells rang across Midway as every available American aircraft scrambled into the air. 26 obsolete Brewster Buffalo and Grumman Wildcat fighters climbed desperately to intercept the incoming Japanese formation. The American pilots, many of them inexperienced reservists and Marine aviators, knew they were flying inferior aircraft against the world's most experienced naval air force. Major Floyd Parks led the Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 221 into what would become a slaughter. At 6:16 in the morning, the aerial combat began 30 miles northwest of Midway. The Japanese Zeros, piloted by veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience, tore through the American fighter screen with devastating efficiency. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 American fighters had been shot down, with only 2 Japanese Zeros lost in return. The surviving American fighters, their ammunition exhausted and their formations shattered, limped back toward Midway as Tominaga's bombers pressed on toward their targets. The Japanese bombs fell on Midway at 6:20 in the morning, striking the power plant, fuel storage tanks, and aircraft hangars with precision. Black smoke billowed into the tropical sky as American ground crews fought fires intended to the wounded. However, crucially, the runway remained operational, and many of the American aircraft had already launched before the attack began. From his command post, Colonel Harold Shannon radioed the fleet. Airfield operational. Many casualties. Need fighters and dive bombers immediately. While Midway burned, Admiral Fletcher aboard the Yorktown was making the most critical decision of his career. The American task forces had been operating under radio silence, but Fletcher knew that speed was now more important than stealth. At 6:07 in the morning, he broke radio silence and ordered both American carrier groups to launch immediate strikes against the Japanese fleet. The element of surprise, so carefully preserved through Rochefort's intelligence work, was about to be unleashed. Meanwhile, Admiral Nagumo faced his first major decision of the day. Tominaga had radioed back that a second strike on Midway would be necessary to completely neutralize the base. However, Nagumo had retained 93 aircraft aboard his carriers, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship operations, in case American naval forces appeared. The Japanese admiral now had to choose: order the second strike on Midway, or keep his reserve armed for naval combat. At 7:15 in the morning, with no sign of American ships detected by his scout planes, Nagumo made the fateful decision to rearm his reserve aircraft with land attack weapons for a second strike on Midway. Across the 4 Japanese carriers, ordnance crews began the laborious process of swapping torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for high-explosive bombs and incendiary weapons. The flight decks became cluttered with aviation fuel lines, ammunition, and ordnance as crews worked frantically to prepare for the second wave. Unknown to Nagumo, American dive bombers and torpedo planes were already winging their way across the Pacific toward his fleet. The trap was closing, but the Japanese admiral remained unaware that his force was about to face the full fury of American naval aviation. The morning sun climbed higher in the tropical sky as both sides prepared for the decisive phase of the battle. That would change the course of the Pacific War. At 7:28 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, the course of World War II pivoted on a single radio transmission. Scout Plane No. 4 from the Japanese cruiser Tone, delayed in its launch by a faulty catapult, finally reported what Admiral Nagumo had dreaded to hear: enemy fleet bearing 01, 0 degrees, composed of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. The message sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. But it was incomplete. The scout had failed to identify any aircraft carriers in the American formation. Nagumo found himself caught in the worst possible tactical situation. His flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed for the second Midway strike. Fuel lines snaked across the deck plates, and ordnance lay stacked in vulnerable positions. The decision to rearm for land attack had consumed precious time, and now American ships were approaching from an unexpected direction. At 7:45, the scout plane sent a correction that chilled every Japanese officer who heard it. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. The American strike groups had launched in 3 separate waves, creating a complex aerial ballet converging on the Japanese fleet. From the Hornet came 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. These obsolete aircraft, slow and poorly defended, represented the epitome of American courage in the face of overwhelming odds. From the Enterprise launched 37 dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, while the damaged Yorktown contributed 17 dive bombers and 12 torpedo planes. Lieutenant Commander Waldron's Torpedo 8 approached the Japanese fleet at 8:20 in the morning, flying low over the Pacific swells. The squadron had become separated from their fighter escort, leaving the lumbering Devastators naked before the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. Zero fighters dove on the American torpedo bombers like hawks on field mice, their 20mm cannons, and 7.7mm machine guns ripping through aluminum fuselages and flesh with equal efficiency. One by one, the Devastators of Torpedo 8 fell, burning into the Pacific. Waldron's aircraft was among the first to be shot down. The squadron commander's last radio transmission a defiant attack immediately. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived the massacre, floating in the ocean and witnessing the remainder of the battle from his life raft. The heroic sacrifice of Torpedo 8 accomplished nothing tactically, but everything strategically. The Japanese fighters were drawn down to sea level, their ammunition partially expended, leaving the high altitude approaches UND, FEMD. The surviving American torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown met similar fates. Torpedo 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft, while Torpedo 3 from Yorktown lost 10 of 12 planes. By 9:20 in the morning, American torpedo aviation had been virtually annihilated, with only 6 aircraft surviving from the original 41 that had attacked. The Japanese fleet sailed on seemingly invincible, their combat air patrol having achieved what appeared to be a complete victory. However, the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had drawn the Japanese fighters down. 2 wave top level, exactly where Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's dive bombers needed them to be. At 10:22 in the morning, McCluskey's SBD Dauntless dive bombers emerged from the morning sun at 14,000 feet, perfectly positioned above the Japanese carriers, and the timing was extraordinary. Nagumo had just ordered his combat air patrol to climb back to altitude when McCluskey's bombers rolled into their attack dives. The scene below was a tactical planner's dream. The Japanese carriers were recovering aircraft from the Midway strike while simultaneously attempting to launch the reorganized strike against the American fleet. Flight decks were crowded with fuel lines, ordnance, and aircraft in various stages of preparation. The Japanese carriers, masters of the Pacific for 6 months, were about to discover that their moment of greatest vulnerability had arrived precisely when their enemies were in position to exploit it, as McCluskey's bombers screamed down through the tropical air toward their targets. The Battle of Midway was about to transform from apparent Japanese victory into devastating defeat. The next few minutes would determine whether the Pacific War would continue as the Japanese advanced toward total victory, or begin the long American march toward Tokyo Bay. At exactly 10:22 in the morning on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his Douglas SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive toward the Japanese aircraft carrier Kaga. Below him, the flight deck appeared as a perfect target, crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance that had been hastily rearmed during the morning's confusion. The next 5 minutes would witness the most decisive phase of naval combat in the Pacific War, a period so crucial that historians would later call it the 5 minutes that changed the world. McCluskey's dive bomber group had been airborne for over 2 hours, searching for the Japanese fleet that had been reported in a position where it no longer existed. By 10 o'clock, with fuel running dangerously low, McCluskey had made the critical decision to continue the search rather than return to Enterprise. His persistence paid off when he spotted the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arashi, which had been left behind after attacking the American submarine Nautilus. Following that wake northward, Kluski's bombers had found Admiral Byrd, Nagumo's carrier force, at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. The first bomb struck Kaga at 10:24 in the morning, penetrating the flight deck near the bridge and detonating among fully fueled aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction as aviation gasoline and ordnance created a hellish inferno that engulfed the carrier's superstructure. Captain Jisaku Okada, commanding Kaga, watched in horror as his ship transformed from a floating airfield into a blazing pyre. The carrier's damage control parties fought desperately against fires that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit simultaneously. Lieutenant Dick Best led his section of 3 dive bombers against the flagship Akagi Best's 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb struck directly behind the carrier's bridge elevator, penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. Among aircraft that had been armed and fueled for the strike against the American fleet, the blast ruptured fuel lines and ignited aviation gasoline, creating an uncontrollable fire that spread throughout the carrier's hangar deck. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi, witnessed the destruction of the ship that had led the Pearl Harbor attack just 6 months earlier, according to detailed analysis from the Naval War College's historical studies. The timing of the American attack was extraordinarily fortuitous. The Japanese carriers were in the worst possible condition to receive an attack, with their flight decks cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines extended, and ordnance positioned for rapid launch operations. The Japanese damage control procedures, while excellent for normal combat damage, were inadequate for the catastrophic fires caused by aviation fuel and armed ordnance detonating simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown completed the devastation by attacking the carrier. Soryu. Leslie had been forced to jettison his bomb due to an electrical malfunction, but his squadron pressed home their attack with deadly precision. Multiple bombs struck Soryu's flight deck, igniting fuel and ordnance that created fires so intense they could be seen from 50 miles away. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto chose to go down with his ship, standing at attention on the bridge as Soryu listed and began her final plunge toward the Pacific floor. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers were blazing wrecks, their seasoned aircrews either dead or struggling in the water. The carrier, Hiryu, operating separately from the main formation, remained operational and immediately launched a counterstrike against the American fleet. However, the balance of naval aviation in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. Japan had lost not only 3 carriers but also the irreplaceable pilots and aircrew who represented years of training and combat experience. The fires aboard the Japanese carriers burned with such intensity that steel deck plates warped and melted. Explosions from stored ordnance continued throughout the afternoon as damage control parties abandoned their hopeless efforts to save the ships. By evening, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu had all been abandoned, their hulks drifting powerlessly as internal explosions continued to rack their burning structures. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from the distant battleship Yamato, received the devastating reports with characteristic stoicism. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood immediately that his carefully planned trap had become a disaster of unprecedented proportions. The 5 minutes between 10:22 and 10:27 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, had transformed the Pacific War from a Japanese advance into an American counteroffensive that would continue unabated until the surrender. Ceremony in Tokyo Bay 3 years later, the blazing hulks of 3 Japanese aircraft carriers painted the western horizon with columns of smoke that rose thousands of feet into the tropical sky. But the Battle of Midway was far from over. At 11:15 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard the carrier Hiryu prepared to launch Japan's final counterstroke. As the only undamaged carrier remaining in the mobile force, Hiryu represented the last hope for salvaging something from the catastrophic morning. Yamaguchi, considered one of the most aggressive and capable admirals in the Imperial Navy, understood that speed was essential. His 18 Aichival dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, hastily prepared for launch, represented the concentrated fury of a wounded empire. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led this strike force into the sky at 11:55. Their target, the American task force that had inflicted such devastating damage on the Kido Butai. The Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, flew with the desperate courage of men who knew their nation's fate hung in the balance. Meanwhile, Admiral Fletcher aboard Yorktown had been tracking the developing battle through fragmentary radio reports from his returning strike aircraft. The carrier had been recovering her dive bombers when radar operators detected incoming aircraft at 46 miles distance. At 12:10 in the afternoon, general alarm sounded throughout the American task forces. Kobayashi's dive bombers appeared as tiny specks against the brilliant blue sky. The American Combat Air Patrol, reinforced by fighters from Enterprise, rose to meet the Japanese attack. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, leading Fighting Squadron 3, employed his innovative Thatch Weave defensive formation to counter the superior maneuverability of the Zero fighters. The aerial combat that followed demonstrated the evolution of American fighter tactics, as Wildcat pilots used teamwork and superior aircraft durability to offset Japanese advantages in speed and agility. Despite the fierce defense, several Japanese dive bombers penetrated the American fighter screen. At 12:11, the first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck, penetrating to the hangar level and causing severe structural damage. A second bomb destroyed the carrier's radar and communications equipment, while a third penetrated deep into the ship's engineering spaces. The explosions killed 37 sailors instantly and wounded dozens more, transforming sections of the carrier into smoking ruins. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's damage control teams formed miracles of seamanship in the aftermath of the attack. Within hours, they had repaired the flight deck sufficiently to resume air operations, restored power to critical systems, and brought the ship's speed back to 24 knots. The rapid restoration of Yorktown's combat capability would prove crucial as the battle entered its final phase at 2:45 in the afternoon. Haryu launched her second and final strike, 10 Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning attack on Midway despite his aircraft's damaged fuel tank, volunteered to lead this final mission, knowing he lacked sufficient fuel to return. His sacrifice epitomized the desperate courage of Japanese naval aviation in their darkest hour. The torpedo attack developed at 4:24 in the afternoon, with Japanese pilots displaying extraordinary skill as they pressed home their assault through heavy anti-aircraft fire. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, causing severe flooding and knocking out all power. The carrier began listing heavily to port as seawater rushed into her engineering spaces through massive holes torn by the torpedo explosions. Captain Buckmaster, recognizing that his ship was in mortal danger, reluctantly ordered abandon ship at 5 in the afternoon. The crew's evacuation proceeded with exemplary discipline as destroyers closed alongside to rescue survivors. However, Yorktown refused to sink immediately, her stubborn hull maintaining enough buoyancy to remain afloat despite catastrophic damage. The carrier would continue to play a role in the battle's final act. Though her fighting days had ended with the torpedo attack, Admiral Yamaguchi's gamble had achieved partial success, eliminating 1 American carrier from the battle. However, Hiryu remained alone against 2 undamaged American carriers. In the afternoon, sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The final act of the Battle of Midway would determine whether Japan's last carrier could escape to fight another day, or whether American dive bombers would complete the destruction of the once mighty Kido Butai. As the tropical sun began its descent toward the western Pacific on the afternoon of June 4th, 1942, the final act of the Battle of Midway prepared to unfold. The carrier, Hiryu, last survivor of Admiral Nagumo's once mighty striking force, steamed desperately through the swells, while American search planes scoured the ocean for her position. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Samuel Adams, flying an SBD Dauntless from Enterprise, spotted the Japanese carrier and her escorts, approximately 110 miles northwest of the American task force. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the carrier Enterprise, received Adams' sighting report with characteristic calm. The methodical admiral understood that this final carrier represented both an opportunity and a threat. Hiryu could still launch additional strikes against the American fleet, but she also offered the chance to complete the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation in the Pacific. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Spruance ordered the launch of his final strike of the day, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise. Supported by 14 from the patched-up Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led the combined strike. Forced through the afternoon sky, his aircraft climbing to attack altitude as they approached the Japanese formation. Below them, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi had positioned Hiryu at the center of a defensive ring formed by the battleships Haruna and Kirishima, heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, and several destroyers. The Japanese formation bristled with anti-aircraft weapons, but Yamaguchi knew that his combat air patrol had been severely depleted by the day's fighting. The attack commenced. At 5:03 in the afternoon, as Gallagher's dive bombers rolled into their 70-degree attack dives, the Japanese anti-aircraft fire created a deadly barrage of bursting shells and tracers. But the American pilots pressed through the defensive fire with determined precision. The first bomb struck Hiryu's forward elevator, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among aircraft preparations for another strike. Within seconds, aviation fuel and ordnance created the familiar hellish fires that had consumed her sister carriers earlier in the day. Additional bombs struck along Haru's length, causing catastrophic damage to her engineering spaces and flight operations areas. Carriers' fire suppression systems, already strained by earlier damage, proved inadequate against the intense fires fed by aviation gasoline and exploding ordnance. Captain Tomio Kaku fought desperately to save his ship, but the combination of structural damage and uncontrollable fires made rescue impossible. Admiral Yamaguchi, recognizing that his flagship was doomed, chose to remain aboard Hiryu as she began her death spiral. The admiral, considered one of Japan's most promising naval commanders, stood on the carrier's bridge as fires engulfed the superstructure around him. His final radio transmission to the combined fleet was characteristically stoic, Hiryu proceeding to ram enemy carriers. However, the carrier's damage was too severe to permit any final offensive action. Meanwhile, the submarine warfare aspect of the Battle of Midway reached its climax as the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Commander Yahachi Tanabe, achieved the only significant Japanese success of the final day. At 4:36 in the afternoon on June 6th, Tanabe's torpedoes struck the disabled Yorktown and the destroyer Hamoon, which had been alongside providing salvage assistance. The destroyer sank within minutes, while Yorktown, already heavily damaged, finally succumbed to this additional assault and rolled over early on the morning of June 7th. The loss of Yorktown provided small consolation for the magnitude of Japan's defeat. By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack lay on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean or were burning uncontrollably as they prepared for their final plunge. With them had perished over 200 aircraft and many of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, losses that the Imperial Navy could never fully replace. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the disaster from his flagship Yamato, faced the bitter reality that his carefully planned operation had resulted in catastrophic defeat rather than decisive victory. The architect of Pearl Harbor recognized that Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been broken beyond repair. At 11:55 on the evening of June 4th, Yamamoto transmitted the order that acknowledged Japan's first major naval defeat: withdraw. The Midway operation is canceled. The withdrawal marked more than the end of a single battle. It represented the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific that would culminate in surrender 3 years later. The dawn of June 5, 1942, broke over. A Pacific Ocean littered with the debris of shattered dreams and broken ambitions. Where Admiral Yamamoto's mighty combined fleet had sailed with confident expectations of decisive victory, only oil slicks, floating wreckage, and the smoke from burning hulks marked the passage of Japan's naval supremacy. The Battle of Midway had ended with a completeness that neither side had anticipated, transforming the Pacific War from Japanese offensive to American. Counterattack in the span of 3 days. Admiral Chester Nimitz received the battle reports at his Pearl Harbor headquarters with characteristic understatement, informing Washington that Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. However, the soft-spoken Texan understood the profound implications of what his forces had accomplished. The Japanese combined fleet had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and over 250 aircraft, while suffering approximately 3,000 casualties. American losses, while significant, paled in comparison. 1 aircraft carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men killed. The human cost of victory extended far beyond mere statistics. In the waters around Midway, hundreds of Japanese sailors and airmen struggled for survival as their ships burned and sank beneath them. Many of the pilots who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack just 6 months earlier now faced death. In the same Pacific waters they had once dominated, Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga, Admiral Yamaguchi of the Hiryu, and countless other experienced officers went down with their ships, taking with them years of irreplaceable naval expertise. Strategic implications of Midway's outcome would resonate throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Japan's carrier aviation, built painstakingly over 2 decades and hardened in the crucible of combat from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, had been effectively destroyed in a single day. The loss of experienced pilots proved even more devastating than the loss of ships, as Japan's pilot training programs could not replace such seasoned aviators. According to post-war analysis by the Strategic Bombing Survey, Japan never fully recovered from the pilot losses suffered at Midway. The battle's conclusion also marked a fundamental shift in American naval strategy. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, immediately began planning offensive operations that would have been impossible before Midway. The victory provided the breathing space necessary for American industrial production to reach full capacity, while simultaneously eliminating Japan's ability to conduct major offensive operations. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed irreversibly to the United States. Emperor Hirohito received news of the defeat in his palace study, the normally impassive monarch reportedly showing visible distress upon learning the extent of the disaster. The emperor's naval aide-de-camp noted in his diary that His Majesty understood immediately that Japan's chances of achieving a negotiated peace had died with the carriers at Midway. The path to total war, with all its implications for the Japanese people, now stretched inevitably ahead. The final irony of the Battle of Midway lay in its origin as a Japanese attempt to force decisive battle on American terms. Admiral Yamamoto had sought to lure the Pacific Fleet into a trap where superior Japanese forces could destroy American naval power permanently. Instead, American intelligence and tactical superiority had turned the trap against its creators, achieving exactly the kind of decisive victory that Yamamoto had planned for Japan. On June 13, 1942, the damaged American task forces returned to Pearl Harbor, where they received a hero's welcome from thousands of sailors, civilians, and military personnel. The same harbor that had witnessed America's entry into World War II, through devastating defeat, now celebrated the victory that marked the beginning of Japan's inevitable retreat.
Admiral Nimitz,
addressing the assembled crews, spoke words that would prove prophetic. The Japanese will never again advance across the Pacific with impunity. The Battle of Midway had lasted for days, but its consequences would echo through the remaining 3 years of the Pacific War. Japan's swift defeat at Midway had indeed ended their expansion across Pacific waters, marking the high tide of the Rising Sun's empire and the beginning of its inexorable decline. The thunder of naval gunfire and aircraft engines that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was finally dying away, replaced by the steady drumbeat of American industrial might. Preparing for the long march to Tokyo Bay,